The Singapore Psychological Society was founded in 1979. For the past 40 years, SPS has been instrumental in helping its members network and advance the practice of psychology in Singapore. In 2015, SPS hosted the ASEAN Regional Union of Psychological Societies Conference to mark Singapore's Golden Jubilee, attracting the brightest minds from the ASEAN, New Zealand and Australia region. Evidently, SPS has come a long way from its humble roots as a professional club in 1979 to the internationally recognized association it is today. But the contributions of psychologists were not always so keenly felt across different industries. From the 1920s to the 1960s, psychologists worked in isolation, mainly applying their expertise in mental health institutions. It was only under the leadership and direction of pioneer psychologists Mr. V.W. Wilson and Mr. Wong Man Kee that psychological services started to branch out into the social, education, and security sectors. When Mr. Fred Long joined Woodbridge Hospital in 1968, he built upon his two predecessors' strategies for how psychology could be applied to best serve Singapore's needs. He went on to set up the Singapore Psychological Society, becoming the society's first president. The greatest push for the development of psychology came in the 1990s after a meeting in 1987 between prominent psychologist Dr. Hans-Jürgen Eysenck and then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. Dr. Eysenck had told Mr. Lee that the headquarters of one major oil company alone typically employed 40 psychologists, more than the total number of post-grad trained psychologists in Singapore at that time. Mr. Lee then promptly and relentlessly began recruiting psychologists in various government sectors, employing their expertise in key roles such as the assessment of political candidates earmarked for higher office.
We did not, at that time, entertain any grand vision when our Singapore Psychological Society was formed in 1979. There were no dreams of making psychology first or making psychology great, but to make psychology known and useful.
People were working in isolation, there was no clear career structure. The Psychological Society, when it was formed in 1979, was really useful in the sense that at least there was one organization that could be a meeting place for different psychologists, could in some way or other represent them.
The society served as a vehicle in which various psychologist members could find a professional identity. We were only hoping that succeeding society leaders would continue to sustain the society and keep it going and growing, which I believe they did to their great credit.
The early days of psychology in the sector were days where there was mainly small groups of people who got together. But those early days were important because now that many of the people who were around in the early days are holding key appointments in the psychological community, right? The psychologist community. It helps a lot because people know one another. There's trust.
From its initial 40 members in 1979, SPS has grown from its humble beginnings to now comprise more than 1,000 members, 2/3 of whom have done postgraduate training in the best programs overseas. Today, SPS members apply their skills in key government organizations such as MINDEF, MOE, and MSF, contributing to the sectors of child development, health, education, security, and more.
For a number of years, NUS was the only place that you could get, psychology coursework. And what's happened over the years is that we now have a number of institutions that are offering psychology coursework.
movement to introduce counseling into schools dated back to as far back as in the 1970s at IE, Institute of Education, when the first director, the late Dr. Ruth Wong, she was a visionary leader ahead of her time, really. She saw the importance of counseling in the schools. So I was recruited to set up this guidance clinic at the then IE. We had a humble start. We had just a small staff of 4 of us. So in 3 years, we managed to receive and follow up about 300 cases. So the breakthrough, I would say, came in 1987 when Dr. Tony Tan, then the Minister for Education. So after returning from an educational tour, and he made the announcement to the whole of Singapore, said that, oh, our schools, we need counselling and counsellors in our schools to help our school children. The challenge to train up as many school counsellors as possible within a short time fell on our shoulders. In 10 years, we managed to train as many as 4,000 teachers. So we are quite happy to see how the whole movement has come to fruition and how the situation now is so, I would say, we have really made an impact now at the national level. And I'm really happy to be involved in this movement.
In the last 40, 50 years ago, our education and system in our schools have been developed very much based on mass customization. So it's children who have extreme difficulties in learning, children who have extreme difficulties in terms of behavior. That's when the SOS comes up and the psychology is brought in. Because psychology has developed, how psychology is applied in education in schools have developed, there's greater scope and greater demand and desire for the application of psychology into the larger system grows.
One of the biggest areas of support that the psychologists have made in the security sector has been in the area of understanding the psychology of terrorism, but also what you do in the aftermath of a terror attack. And these 3 ministries, MHA, MSF, as well as IMH, have come together to set up these things called HEART teams. And these HEART teams will assist the constituencies in Singapore in the aftermath of a terror attack.
In MSF and the social service sector, we play a role in providing clinical services like assessment, therapy, research, training and consultation for a diverse group of clients. We have also contributed to the sector in terms of training other professionals like social workers and counsellors over the years, imparting some of the psychological knowledge that we have and skills in terms of therapeutic practice to them. We've also implemented a lot of standardized assessment frameworks. There is also a lot more emphasis on evidence-based practice, program evaluation, implementation science and research.
So actually SPS first reached out in 2011. The whole idea was to find a way of identifying early persons with intellectual or mental disabilities in the criminal justice system. SPS was absolutely essential in terms of getting volunteers trained to be able to, number one, administer the test, and then secondly, to analyze the results as well. So without SPS's help, I don't think we've had sufficient data to actually validate the screening test. Subsequently, SPS was also very, very key in terms of getting sufficient number of volunteers to come and help out as appropriate adults. So really hoping that we can find more platforms for meaningful collaboration between lawyers and psychologists, and definitely having the psychologists on board can make a big qualitative difference in terms of interventions.
Psychology began to develop into rather specialized areas. SPS realized that we needed to meet that needs of our members. Hence, we then started the special interest groups, starting with clinical, educational, organizational, and that really allowed members in these specific fields to come together, exchange ideas, support one another, and to actually share best practices. With the growing interest of psychology and more psychology graduates coming into the profession, Singapore Psychological Society recognized the need to start protecting users of psychological services. Hence, we set up the Singapore Register of Psychologists, where we benchmark the standards, for the practice of psychology as they are being offered to the public.
Psychology shapes everything we do and can positively impact individuals, families, and society. As SPS enters its 40th year, its members will continue to deepen and widen the practice of psychology so as to take on increasingly complex problems in society. A transdisciplinary approach, strong collaborative mindset, coupled with the sense of sacrifice and tenacity of SPS members, will ensure that SPS remains highly relevant and useful.
To make an impact on society, psychologists need to recognize the importance of teamwork. We have to work as a team with other occupational groups and professions such as psychiatrists, lawyers, sociologists, political scientists, counselors, and so on.
Today, our problem is different. There are a lot of people studying psychology. Today, there are local programs in psychology. So in terms of developing a more local flavor of the practice of psychology in Singapore, I think we have a better chance. The next evolution for the society is about the quality of the practice, right? So the idea of regulation comes in. So I think this idea of a collective future, shared outcome is something that we must always bear in mind if we want to move the society forward, to make a difference to our larger Singaporean society. Any country, any people, it's not just about the ability to do something, it's not just about education, it's about the will. And when you have that will combined with the ability, which our people as Singaporeans are very well known for and have the capacity for, actually then you have a very potent force. And Singapore can be a little red dot, but we can certainly punch above our weight in this region.